Okay, as a start, would you mind saying and spelling your name?
My name is Betty Shamieh, Bettyshamieh.
Great. And can you just give me a brief autobiographical sketch, and you can be as elaborate or not as you like, but just briefly kind of who you are, where you're from, what you've done, what you're doing now.
I'm a writer primarily and a theater artist. I am the daughter of Palestinian immigrants and grew up in San Francisco. I work primarily in theater, and I am very interested in comedy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and well, let's go back to San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how did you get your start in theater there, or did that happen later?
I started writing plays in high school and acting in, local theater productions. And so I started out my life at UC Berkeley, mm-hmm. and I decided I wanted to be a writer, and I said I'm going to spend a year writing plays, 2 years writing poetry, and 1 year writing fiction, because I thought that that's how you study to be a writer. And I always say I'm still in my first year of playwriting. I've never gone beyond that, even decades later. So, but that was kind of an indication of not so much my hubris, though it is an indication of that too, but it's also an indication of what the kind of professionalism I and many young writers start out their career with, this idea that you can learn how to do a thing within a certain amount of time or within a degree program. Mm-hmm. And I don't feel that way anymore.
The comedy part of it, where did that come from? Was that from the start an ambition of yours?
I think one of the things I really connected with was the work of Eddie Murphy. I felt like growing up there were only two ways to be in American culture, either black or white, and I knew I wasn't white. So I felt very, very connected to the kind of ribald humor of someone like, Eddie Murphy and his precursors. And so I felt that the best way to articulate the kind of uncomfortableness of desiring so much to be part of the American mainstream and not finding access to it was through comedy. Mm-hmm. And I also feel like there's a real big connection between comedy and power, that if you can make someone laugh, they can't hate you as much for that moment that they're laughing at you. And so I felt that it was the best way to talk about very serious subject matter. Mm-hmm. Although I do write about the Arab American experience, I think if my work is looked at 50 years from now, it's going to be more important that I am a woman writing at this time. I think the context in which I'm viewed tends to be Arab American, but I think the fact that I am a woman writer and write about women's issues is something that isn't really associated with my work as much, but mm-hmm. I think is really the thing that distinguishes me. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very interested in using comedy to kind of bridge the gaps between different types of people, whether it's different genders, different races.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested in what you said about comedy and power. Can you describe... Well, I guess there's a narrow question and a broad question here. The narrow question is, how did you come to that conclusion that comedy was an idiom for you that was going to be expressive of something important politically? The slightly broader question is the bigger question about just philosophically your own understanding of the relationship between comedy and power, and kind of what you ultimately are hoping to do in that register. This is actually kind of a coming to consciousness question about genre and political consciousness.
I've been trying to study the relationship between comedy and power to kind of understand what is that fleeting sense of control you feel when you make somebody laugh, whether it's an audience member or a date or an interviewer, or, it's a sense of real that I'm in control of this situation. And I think what makes things funny is connections that are obvious but under the surface. So, the thing about comedy is you have to understand where the person is coming from in order to respond to what they're saying. And I think that understanding where a person is coming from is a question of Oh, here I'm going to get all confused. But essentially, it's about making the experience or the connections that you see common to the people around you. And I think that there is some sort of psychological power in making people see connections. So I'm not going to be incredibly articulate about it, but I think that many, many minorities use comedy as a way to kind of gain a sense of cultural control, to say that I decide what are the connections that you see, which I think is what comedy is about. It's about leveling the playing field. That if we can both think this is funny, then there's really not that much difference. But I've read up a lot about the subject, the idea of power, whether it's in personal dynamics, whether if you as a presidential candidate, if you can make people laugh. I mean, I don't remember which presidential candidate said something about Bush having a lumber, he had some sort of illegal activity connected to some lumber, and Bush said, "I don't even know what you're talking about." And then he looked to the audience and he said, "You got wood? Do you need wood?" And I just remember in that moment he had that audience. I think it was Gore, but there was one person who was kind of trying to make a really salient point about his family's money and the kind of power that was associated with it, and just by nature of saying, well, if I have that, then I'm going to obviously try to sell it, and I'm going to sell it to this audience, made the audience on his side in a very scary way. So I think I think power of comedy can be demonic, actually, because it can make people seem much more clever than people who are trying to make very salient points.
So aside from Eddie Murphy, who are some of the other figures that you look to as models in that kind of political satirical realm?
It's funny because people like Eddie Murphy, who start out making really important comedic statements, kind of in order to get mainstream, they become they do sillier things, it's kind of like Hollywood takes these really important kinds of cultural figures and not so much whitewashes them, but dumbs them down. I think one of the things that I'm really interested in with the Occupy Wall Street movement is, when you're a minority and you feel under siege, you have to be an activist. I mean, I'm by nature a very, frankly, I'm quite bourgeois. I like nice things. I like to be able to afford to travel. These things are important to me. But because of by nature of being a Palestinian American and an Arab American and feeling very unsafe in the culture, it forces you into a realm that isn't naturally your bent. And, I think if you had told me 10 years ago that I would go to the Occupy Wall Street protests and I would see signs that say things like, protest like an Egyptian, the idea that mainstream American youth would be influenced by democratic, peaceful movements in the Middle East, I would have told you it's more likely that Martians come from the moon. The idea that we as Americans would be learning from the Middle East, because I kind of absorbed those ideas that America is the font of democracy and we export how to protest to other places. Even given my background, I still had that ideology. So it's been very disorienting in a wonderful way to kind of see that turnaround. Now, that being said, I think embedded in our language is the idea that we are not, as members of a democratic society, supposed to be involved. For example, instead, the idea of using our democratic rights, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of speech, even voting, you are called an activist if you do that. Instead, so the idea is the norm is passivity. And instead of calling those people pacifists, not pacifists, but pacifists, and saying the norm is to participate in your democracy. That's how normal people act. I mean, you could poll anybody on the street and there's something that is close enough to their heart, whether it's gay rights or women's rights or minority rights or, rights in terms of the Tea Party, to hold on to, your values. There are things that make every single American angry enough to go out in the street and carry a sign, but it's not normal for us to do that. So we think of it as bizarre behavior.
Right.
And so, but that's how we talk. So even activists call themselves activists instead of saying, well, we're just normal.
Right.
And people who don't participate in their own lives are abnormal. So I'm really interested in the idea of language and how we characterize ourselves as, what is the norm, and who is outside that norm, and the fact that I'm not so surprised by the idea, although it was astounding to me how it shaped up, that America is influenced by the Middle East. But I'm astounded by, as somebody who lives between two cultures and travels between those worlds, I'm very excited by the idea of people understanding the connections, the idea of youth movements in different cultures. That isn't something I've seen before. So even though I do feel there's cultural connections that are very clear, the fact that there's an acknowledgement within the Occupy movement, of those connections is very exciting to me.
Okay, I want to come back to this current moment in a minute, but first let's loop back and I want to go back to something you said a little while ago about you seeing your work as being more important as a kind of feminist statement, but you're always pegged as a Palestinian American writer.
Yeah.
I'm really interested. I mean, obviously, there's no need for you to pigeonhole yourself in one way or the other, or the categories aren't distinct. But I'm curious about the terrain that you see yourself operating on. So can you talk a little bit more about, first of all, why is it, do you think, that you feel the feminist part of your work is the most important part, and why do you think it is that from the outside people are seeing you more as an Arab writer?
Well, I think it comes more to how I saw myself. And because, I am the first Palestinian American playwright who's been produced off Broadway or taught in major universities and multicultural theater courses, because I kind of have that mantle, and thankfully there's many, many other people who are coming up that are very interesting Arab American writers and voices, so there isn't this idea of there's something I'd like to say about the idea of exceptional people, that I think it's very easy for people to see one minority member like Obama as an exceptional person. The rule is, African Americans are this way, and that person is exceptional. So that people don't really change their rules. And I feel that some people, when they meet me as somebody of Arab descent and a woman, they don't really change their perceptions of how Arab women are in the world. They think I'm exceptional to that rule. And I think that's something that's very interesting to me. But looping back again, because it was so hard for me to occupy that space of being an Arab American, and that was the way that I was characterized, I wasn't really aware that my play, The Black Guide, which was off-Broadway in 2007, was one of the only plays in recent history that had an all-female cast off-Broadway. It was how the world was seeing me was influencing how I saw the world. And it was only when the reviews kept mentioning it that I realized, wow, there's this whole other part of my identity that is as important, and I write as much thematically about it. But because I'm not viewed in that way, I saw my work in a certain way. When I'm produced abroad, in places like Greece, they don't do my work because they're interested in multiculturalism or Palestinian issues. It tends to be women who are interested in women's issues. So when you're taken out of your cultural context, you see yourself differently. But I think it was simply that I was, because the world had labeled me in a certain way, and I had seen myself in a certain way, and then I realized that there's this whole other label that is actually as important, because it's not as important in the tiny microcosm of American theater, which is much more racially segregated, and you become an African American or a Palestinian American much more than a woman or a man writer. So I think it's something I've come to, and I'm actually really excited by the idea that I didn't know what I was really thematically hitting upon more strongly than. And it may be because it's so hard to be a Palestinian American playwright that that the mantle of being a woman playwright, it was only recently that I really understood that only 16% of plays are produced by women, and that's the same number as 100 years ago. And that, that if you go to law school or medical school, that the numbers are much better. That if MoMA has 3% of women artists, that art hasn't caught up with the rest of the world.
That's so counterintuitive, isn't it?
It is and it isn't, because I think it's very easy to see people who fit into molds, like lawyers and doctors, but people who are innovative, whether in politics or intellectual activity or artistic activity, you kind of, I think we all have our own biases. I mean, when I was looking for an agent, I remember feeling like maybe I should go with a male agent, like maybe that would be a better, that I think when it comes to the idea of intellectual or artistic or political innovation, those kinds of old stereotypes of what those people look like, what artists look like, and whereas in safer realms, or realms where it's not so, you're not really innovating, you're not really expressing the ideas of the culture. It's easier to kind of permeate those places. The numbers show that. I mean, I don't know how much faculty, tenured faculty, how that compares at universities to artists. But women artists are doing quite poorly in America, mm-hmm. as are women politicians.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. So now coming back to where we were a moment ago about the current moment. First of all, that phrase, the current moment in America, can you tell me a little bit about what that means to you? Because I've been speaking with all different kinds of people across the country for the last couple of years, and there's this very widespread sense that there's something very special or portentous or dangerous or hopeful, but special about this moment that we're in, but there's not at all a consensus about what the meaning is. So when I say our current moment, I mean, what are the kinds of things that you think about as being important about the moment we're in?
Well, I think one of the things that's important is the idea of, when you have an African American president and a Democratic president, it calls into question how different they are actually on the policy level from Republicans, which I think is very small. I think the two parties we have are astoundingly similar. And I think the Occupy movement is a reaction to the kind of, that you're really choosing between two things that are incredibly similar in terms of how the structure of the society. And I think that the realization of that and the kind of response to that is what is defining our current moment, that you're deciding between two things that are almost the same. And that how one empowers a different option is not like the Occupy movement, not fully articulated. But there is one thing, I think it's important to say, as Arab Americans who, I'm a member of and trying to ensure that the rights are respected, when there is any sort of violation of civil rights of Arab Americans, it is astoundingly clear that the Republicans are much more helpful than the Democrats, because Democrats don't like to be seen as weak or pro-terrorism. And it's so easy to paint a Democratic presidential candidate or a Democratic senator as, somebody who's soft on terror, that it's actually counterintuitive. The people that you think would be more interested in civil rights are actually Republicans who believe in...
Fascinating. Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion, much of which I've participated in, having to do with the fact that, around the Park 51, the Cordoba House, mm-hmm. That whole initiative, there was just this spike in anti-Muslim activity that was very vocal and visible, and it was kind of in your face in a way that hadn't even been the case right after 9/11.
Yeah.
And most of the interpretations I've heard about that had to do with race, and had to do especially with when there's this kind of politics of white displacement that goes along with having a black president that then kind of gets expressed in this way. But what you're saying is quite different and very interesting. So,
well, I think both things are true. I mean, I do think in that the people who are angry enough to protest are probably have a lot of feelings about Obama being president. But it is very much true that as a response to that, people who are Democratic hopefuls are less responsive to the Arab American and Muslim community. So it's a double, it's like a part of a continuation. They're very cognizant of the fact that there is this kind of reaction to somebody who looks like Obama, whose middle name's Hussein, being in the White House. And I do very much feel, and expressed at the time, that it was a reaction to Obama, because nothing like that happened under Bush.
I want to spend some time traversing this last 10 years or so, but let's start with the last 3.
Okay.
The Obama years. Can you just narrate for me your own experience of the Obama presidency, starting with your sense of him through that first election cycle, your hopes for him, what it meant to you that he was elected, and then kind of how you've thought about his presidency over time?
Well, I mean, one of the things is it's hard not to like the guy, just like it's hard not to like JFK, even though he didn't do much for civil rights, and it was actually Lyndon Johnson who, and that's what the kind of power of whether it's comedy or presence, that is something that as a theater artist one explores a lot. Like what makes people who actually on paper are not doing anything much more than their predecessors have, or are doing very problematic things, So I'm very interested in this idea that I can't help but like President Obama, even though I'm incredibly disappointed with him and feel that and maybe that's because when a presidential, because I didn't listen to him. If you go to a place like Holland and they hear somebody saying "God bless America," they say, we would never in Holland say "God bless Holland." That seems so ridiculous to us. So when somebody, makes references to their Christian faith and, says "God bless America," you kind of think he's winking at you. But actually, you have to listen to candidates and what they say, because that has meaning too. It's hard not to like President Obama. It's hard not to like Michelle Obama. It's hard not to want them to invite me to the White House. But the fact of the matter is, I feel as an Arab American, I feel very vulnerable even under an Obama administration. And
can you narrate that a little bit? Do you remember, are there specific turning points or moments from the early year or so?
I mean, I guess one of the things that was particularly problematic for me is just how the peace process has been handled. It's been really hard. The kind of language around the peace process, but also the fact that, even things like Troy Davis, it's harder when there is somebody who represents to you an achievement to put them in the White House. When something like that happens under someone's watch, they become responsible for an entire, panoply of things that they probably can't reasonably be responsible for. So I don't, I tend to. It's that kind of dual thing of really liking somebody, but also feeling like they could do more, and the people who put them in power. I mean, it would be very interesting to see, for me, in 10 years, what Obama's legacy is, because on the cultural level, it is so important for any minority, and I did not feel in my lifetime that anybody, who looked like Obama and had a name like Obama. My parents gave me and my brother American names because they thought that that's the only way you could survive in America. So that's different, and that's wonderful. So on a cultural level, but it will be very interesting if in 10 years after there's been a black president, unemployment rates in the black community shift, college graduate rates in the Black community shift. It'll be more interesting in a 10, 15, 20 year retrospect. That's, I think, when we're going to be able to see
what it really means.
Yeah, what it means, because to me, it doesn't mean a lot on the policy level. So
far, certainly not.
Yeah.
Or in just kind of the vital statistics of our social profile. I mean,
right.
We're still as stratified as ever. The unemployment figures show a kind of racial divide that, is not anything different from 1995 or 1965.
Yeah,
so it's more of the same. On the other hand, I mean, one of the things, it's interesting you said you never thought, I mean, because that's the refrain that you hear again and again, and it doesn't even matter who you're talking to.
Yeah.
Nobody thought that we were capable of electing a president like him. Even in 2007, nobody saw it on the horizon, right? Except for maybe Obama himself.
Which is astounding.
It is astounding,
yeah.
And so it makes you kind of reevaluate the last few decades. You think, under the surface there was a deep kind of shifting going on, and so what you're saying about looking forward over the next 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, the next generation, I mean, maybe something as profound can take us from here to there, but we probably won't know it for a while.
I think so, and I hope so. I mean, you can't tell any little kid now that you can't be president because of the color of your skin or your name, and that's an astounding shift. But one has to remember, we are also a culture that has Jesse Ventura as a governor, Schwarzenegger as a governor of one of the largest I think it's the sixth economy in the world is California. I mean, we are a ridiculous culture when it comes to, because I work in theater and politics so much is about theater and charisma, that's also really interesting to me, the idea that one super charismatic person who is completely has a tonal ability to read social situations, which I think, a lot of people disagree with me, but I think if you are raised by white people, you know how to talk to them differently. If you are continually having to address people whose experiences are different from age 0 than yours, I think you know how to deal. I mean, it's just something I notice. If somebody has a person whose mother is of color versus their father, I feel their ability to assimilate, if your mother is of color, is different than a person whose mother, even if it's like you're taught how to deal with the world by who raises you, and you're taught how to articulate your experience with who raises you. So I think something about, Obama's when the Reverend Wright thing happened, his ability to talk to white America about that experience, I think, was very much shaped by his needing to always be able to address people who were...
Right. It's interesting because that was such an earth-shaking speech in so many ways, that Philadelphia race speech that he gave back in that March or so of 2008. On the other hand, I've heard a kind of chilling analysis of it that says, if now knowing what we know about Obama as a leader, if you go back to that speech, you can totally see the kind of compromiser in him being described in deep kind of detail.
Wow.
About him as the young boy Obama, kind of trying to reconcile these worlds that he was traversing,
right.
and that what he comes out with is this sense of he's always the one who's saying we can come together, right? That's his calling card, and he's held out that olive branch again and again and again to an opposition that is nothing but a buzzsaw. And it's been frustrating and painful and many things. But it's interesting to think that maybe it's related to the same thing that gave us that speech in Philadelphia.
Yeah, I haven't heard or learned about that, but I think that makes a lot of sense. That idea that in life you can't always compromise. But I also feel like he's an incredibly smart politician, and I don't think that I think he's trying to handle it in the way that he's handled other things, and I think the office of the presidency has actually less power than we give it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think he's like this pansy who doesn't know how to handle things in the way that I feel like sometimes in the left it's very easy to say, I think he's, he always comes across looking as reasonable as can be in those kinds of circumstances, which, he spent the first 4 years, as every president does, running for re-election. So he can't be alienating to independents at any point in his 4 year. He can't come out. I think most people who love Obama as much as I really like him believe that he isn't really how he's acting, which I think is dangerous. I think that that's the ultimate evil charisma. You know what I mean? To be like, you're not saying anything I want you to be saying. You're not doing most of the things you said you'd do, and yet I love you. I think that that's very problematic. Which is why I keep insisting in every realm that I can talk about it, that it is actually the Republicans who care more about civil rights when it comes to it, who can become appalled.
So can you say more about that?
Well, there was a kid named Fahad Hashmi, and he's now spent 10 years. I don't know all the details of the case, but essentially he was held pre-trial in Lower Manhattan in solitary confinement. And there's something called special administrative measures that just kept getting tightening, limiting the number of pages he could write his family. He could see people once a month or so. He was basically in solitary confinement 2 years pre-trial. And he was a Brooklyn College kid who, said a bunch of incendiary remarks, like he thinks that, just incendiary. The way it looks to me, having met his parents, is that he took up radical Islam as in the way that you take up radical hippieism. You know what I mean? And he just got caught in the system, and he, after 2 years of being in solitary confinement, going up against a Bush judge, decided to say, he was being accused of having a friend stay over his house in London who had waterproof socks and ponchos that were going to Al-Qaeda. So that was the big thing. So that was 2 counts of material support of Al-Qaeda. And so he was facing life imprisonment. So after 2 years, he kind of said, okay, I did it, And so he's being held for solitary confinement now, I think in Florida. And the theater movement, this group called Theater Against War, which I'm a part of, decided we're going to every Monday, which is the Dark Night, do a radio show because his radio was taken away. He's in solitary confinement, and for some reason they decided to take away his radio. And he was also allowed not to read news except 30 days old. So we got very famous. We got Bill Irwin and Wallace Shawn, Kathleen Chalfant, and big people in the theater community to go down and read news that was 30 days old and do protests. And it was only really Republicans, primarily, who were appalled by the idea, who were willing to go on record and say, primarily, there were some Democrats, that you can't hold an American citizen pre-trial in solitary confinement for 2 years. You can't. That's not speedy trial. That's crazy. And the Democrats that we tried to get to just go on record and say he's an American citizen, can't treat, you know what I mean? Like, you can't do that to somebody. But it was very, very frustrating for me because, it was around the time that a Belarusian theater company was being really horribly attacked by their government. And the whole theater community got behind this Belarusian group, whereas it was very hard to get major American artists who were not already identified as leftist willing to say, yes, this guy made incendiary statements and he has a long beard and, probably you might not want him to dinner. But, as an American citizen, he should have a right to say things that are incendiary and upsetting and not be held in solitary confinement. So that was for me really earth-shattering because I'm sure that in the course of my life I've said things that are incendiary. And I really have always felt that if there was another attack on the level of 9/11, that even though my family are Christians, until recently most Arab American, or the majority of Arab Americans were Christians, it's now become Muslim. the majority. And even though I went to fancy, schools like Harvard and Yale and have access to, people like Chomsky and people that most people don't have access to, I feel like that things like that could have happened to me really easily if there was another attack on the level of 9/11. And I don't feel safe in that culture. And the fact that the theater community was willing to do so much to support Belarusian rights, and that they wouldn't even come out and read, we were reading articles from the Post because we wanted it to be funny, that this person only had access to things that were 30 days. And that I and everybody I knew really hustled to get high-level people to come down and just, say, as an American citizen, this shouldn't happen. The level of people, the small number of people who were willing to do that was really upsetting to me. So that's a long story, but
but an important one, because the thing that grabs most people's attention is like these hearings that Peter King was running, the kind of anti-Muslim hearings in Congress. So there's a way in which, at least on the left side of things, we tend to just have this knee-jerk, well, of course the Republicans are the bad ones on this question.
Yeah.
Right? Which, they're bad enough.
Yeah.
But it's interesting what you're saying.
Well, they're not as afraid as Democratic candidates, they're not, I don't think you become a Democratic candidate hoping that you'll be a bad guy and refuse to return phone calls about, somebody who lives in your district, whose father's a civil servant and who went to Brooklyn College.
Right. You just become that person.
So, but it was very astounding. In my limited way, it really made me feel like, wow, if I was politically suddenly hot button, none of these people would support me and help me, and there, but by the grace of God, I go, I wouldn't do well in solitary confinement, I don't know if I could handle that. So, but the fact that most Americans don't know that there are people being held in solitary confinement for years and who are American citizens, within walking, it was, in Lower Manhattan, within walking distance of the theater district, that to me is also in its way, really astounding that we don't know that it isn't in the forefront of our minds, that this is happening to people. Because frankly, the impression that you feel, talking about the cultural moment, is there's such a high level of fear in a post 9/11 world that most people really don't want to ask too many questions or care to ask too many questions about what's happening.
I wanted to ask you about that. So if we take the present moment and kind of peel it like an onion, it's important that we're living in the post-Obama election moment. We're living in post-Katrina. I think that is still important in a certain way. I think going forward, I suspect it's going to be important that we're in the kind of post-Occupy movement.
Yeah.
That seems to have been a substantial shift in our political discussion. Obviously, it's also the post-9/11 moment, and I'm wondering kind of what your experience has been or continues to be of that, and kind of looking forward from here. How long, do you expect that 9/11 is just going to keep reverberating through your lifetime?
I always say that I grew up being terrified of the Russians. I went to a Catholic school, and some of the nuns didn't. I was a student in the 80s, and we used to do drills and stuff, put your head, which I always thought was insane, because how is covering your neck going to save you from, with your head cowering under a desk going to save you from, but, there you go, there it is. Yeah. So I grew up terrified of Russians. I had nightmares about Russians. I watched, the Twilight Zone episode, where Russians were terrifying to me. And then within my relatively short lifetime, I realized that people are having nightmares about Osama bin Laden, and that I really think within my lifetime, it's probably going to be China or India that becomes the new big bad, and because I saw how frightened I was of Russians, growing up in a fairly liberal, my parents moved in the 60s into the San Francisco area, so it wasn't like we were, talking about Russians all day, but I do have a sense that who the enemy is shifts. and the old enemy becomes obsolete, you know. So I can't wait till China is the big bad guy, and then I can, you know, breathe easy and be like, yeah, they suck, or whatever people do, and, you know. But, you know, I think what was very hard for me about being a New Yorker in a September 11th world was because I was doubly afraid. I'm a slightly neurotic person. I was afraid to, you know, be near the Empire State Building, and that, you know, I had those fears, but I also had the fears that if this happens again, I actually had a bigger reaction to the plane going down a month or so afterwards.
Oh, the Dominican plane.
Because I was so sure that was another attack, and that it was going to keep happening, that it was just going to happen every month, that I actually physically fainted. You know, I heard it on the news in a cafe, and I fainted because I was like, I had a bigger reaction because I was just waiting for the next thing that was going to, like, and I really feel that if attacks kept happening, and even small level stupid individual people, you know, like you, shoe bomber guy, or, you know, that there would be no protest if there was a roundup of Arab Americans, you know, and Muslim Americans. I really felt that the culture was that terrified, and
was that something that you felt immediately, like on 9/11, when you first kind of understood what it was that had happened that morning? I mean, how long did it take you to kind of metabolize what it might mean for you?
It took me. See, it's funny because I went to Yale Drama, and I spent my 3 years at Yale Drama deciding that I was gonna, you know, this idea of being a universal playwright was really important to me because, frankly, you get pigeonholed incredibly quickly, and, you know, I'm the person that everybody invites to a panel, but nobody really wants to produce. That's in America anyway, that's been my you know, that I have much more visibility than I actually get productions, because of this kind of pigeonhole thing. You know, we did a American Soldier play, and so we're not talking about Iraq, you know, and I'm like, that's not, you know. But so when I was at Yale Drama for 3 years, I hid all my stuff about Arab Americans. I was writing it, and like a year later, I looked at the stuff and I realized the best work that I had done was about, that had Arab American characters. It wasn't necessarily about being Arab American, and so in August 2001, I did a Fringe Festival show called Chocolate and Heat, Growing Up Arab in America. And basically, it was coming of age stories that had nothing to do with being Arab American. So I invited people to an ethnic show and then just gave them a show about people and was like, bye. You know, like that was my point. It was tongue in cheek to be like, this sounds like an ethnic show, but it's not. So, and then 3 weeks later, 9/11 happened. So I picked the worst time to come out as an Arab American in the theater community. I was like, here I am. Oh no, here I'm not. So, and of course the show, you know, doing a show entitled Growing Up Arab in America and being tongue in cheek about it. And I had a chance to extend it. So I pushed the extension. I said, let me give, you know, I'm not sure that I don't want the theater to be bombed. So we pushed it till February, the extension of the show.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference in audience reactions pre and post?
It's been really interesting. I wasn't enough of a, you know, I just got out of drama school in 2000, so I wasn't enough of a established person before 9/11 to really know. But my perception is that, and it's something everybody wanted to learn about. Everybody wanted to learn. You know, they were going to the theater to learn about a different culture, which I think is very strange and odd. You know, like if you learn about Russians through Three Sisters, you're really screwed. You know what I mean? Like the whole point of a story is that it doesn't matter where they are, and it doesn't matter where, you know, what time period. So I felt that was. I was very concerned with people coming and, you know, I mean, my stories are very specific and my sensibility is very specific. But I think one of the things that I always say is that my presence as an Arab American is more important than what I actually say in my work about being Arab American, or, you know, because I think that the idea that people can identify with somebody who's so different is more important than actually. So I found that a little bit. People would say things like, "I actually identified with the characters, and they don't have headdresses on." But which is okay. I mean, it's okay to not know a lot about a different culture. But I find it, it's something I see a lot. Third world cultures tend to be harder on women in general because poorer women tend to, if you're of the upper middle class, you're working? If you're of a certain class in Egypt or Pakistan, you become educated and have access to things. And it's because so many people are poor and lower classes tend to conserve the resources for males that I think much of the Arab world looks the way it looks. That if the economy was more balanced, if there was more of a middle class, I mean, particularly the Palestinian women are graduating in greater numbers than the men. There's a lot of reasons for that, but that's not a perception. And sometimes I find it difficult to kind of be like, you're not here to learn about how many Palestinian American graduates are. You know what I mean? Like, you're here to see a play. And I think that's, and I don't know how one penetrates that. I don't, because I do feel like there is that exceptionalism. That is the sense that Betty's funny and hip, but Arabs aren't. You know what I mean? I don't know how one changes that, which I think happens with people like Obama. That this one person is cool and they understand my middle class references. That they're an exception to the rule. I think that's why we think it's so strange when someone says, "Oh, all my best friends are gay," and if you have a gay friend, it's very easy to have one person as an exception, and that it's laughable. The idea that friendship, destroys the kind of, because if that was really true, that if friendship meant that you saw people of that race as human as you, that we wouldn't laugh at that statement. We'd be like, "Oh, you have a friend who is gay or Jewish or Arab." That means, that you think of people from that ethnicity as just as human and just as complex and interesting. Whereas instead we're like, really,
right.
So, or that, yeah.
Well, so going back to Chocolate and Heat, I mean, there's a sense in which there's a kind of assimilationism that is incredibly powerful, even though in the post-civil rights era we're taught to actually not value assimilationism as much as we value pluralism.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, assimilationism carries within it a kind of protest against all of the slanders, right, about how you are not us.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it sounds like that's part of the critique that's at work in that play. And it sounds like it could have been the most powerful thing possible in the immediate post 9/11 moment.
Well, we did do the show, and some of the critics got it, but it's like they'd say things like weirdly apolitical,
Because it wasn't rabid, or is that what they wanted, or is
well, I mean, and the other thing is what is a political statement? Ultimately that's the most powerful. Well, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, I mean, because throughout your career, it seems that if not politics, at least kind of a political vision has been totally infused in your creative work, and it's very hard to kind of tease the two apart in any way.
And it's not incredibly, and this is something about the moment in America in general, people like Camus and Sartre and even Shamieh, in French culture, the idea of, a political artist versus an artist, our artists are Tennessee Williams, O'Neill. They're not people who are at the forefront of articulating new visionary ideas about society. So America as a culture doesn't that's not those aren't who we think of as our primary artists. Maybe somebody like Tony Kushner is able to traverse that kind of a little bit, but I think the iconic, certainly playwrights of the last 100 years, are not people who really grapple with their moment and what it means to be who they are. And even though, but actually there's Arthur Miller, And he was incredibly political for his time, I guess. Well, maybe it's not true. But as a whole, I think that other cultures don't see distinctions between this is political art and this is, apolitical art. Because ultimately, I'm very confused, like I'm a very confused person. I'm an American. America doesn't have a great history of foreign policy in the Middle East. Yet I like being an American. I like all the privileges that being an American gives me. So that makes one inherently confused. So the idea that I'm going to be able to, articulate or pontificate or not really. I think what people, when they say political, they mean bad. You know what I mean? They mean visible lines of someone's, and I think the most interesting art is the one that's the hardest thing to swallow, is the idea that we're all the same, and that some people don't have as much resources, and that most of us actually are okay with that. You know what I mean? That's the most salient, difficult, hard to swallow. Most of us are okay with that. Most of us are okay with, lower middle class boys and some women dying in places we haven't heard of to keep our way of life. We don't say it, but we're not out there stopping it. Most of us are okay with, the top 1%. It's very interesting to see the top 1% is college presidents are in the top 1%. A really good oral surgeon is probably in the top 1%, and most of us are fine with that, the distinction between someone like Bill Gates and someone who runs a university, and I mean, maybe it should be the top 5% of the 1%, or the top.
Well, I have seen that broken out.
Yeah.
There's the 0.01%.
Yeah, exactly.
They're really fabulously wealthy. They're really insanely rich.
Rich is whatever you're not. When it comes to taxes.
Well, so I know that you've traveled a lot, but you've also mounted your own work in various places in Europe and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Is that further confusing, or is it clarifying to have those kinds of experiences in different parts of the world?
Well, I think it's clarifying as an artist, and it's liberating as an artist, but it also, for me, reinforced the fact that I really do see myself as American. That almost if it happens in German, it didn't really happen. If the New York Times didn't see it and either praise it or kill it, if my friends can't see it in my little theater circle, and that kind of provincialism, I didn't realize I was subject to it in the way that I am, because literally my last 5 plays, I've seen them, 3 of them I've seen in translation. I haven't seen them in English, which is very disorienting as an artist, because when you work on a play, when it opens, you realize everything you did wrong, and you go back and you fix it. But if it's in a different culture, you can't, my artistry. But I'm sure it's also given me advantages because I can try things and not really care because the reviews are in German or Greek or whatever. So, but I think, I spent a lot of time very upset in Europe, and being like, I can't get these plays to even places that, like Blanche Dubois. I mean, it's terrible to say, but Blanche Dubois always says, "I'm here where I'm not wanted and I'm ashamed to be." That's how I felt. Really small theaters were rejecting these plays that were running for several months, and in some cases seasons in Europe, and in rotating rep, because they kind of they keep 20 plays in rotating rep for years. So the fact that I couldn't have these plays seen in the city that I live in, at places that you would think would be excited to be produced, but I'm not the only person. Wallace Shawn had every play of his, I think, a whole season at the Royal Court, which is the major place in London to have your plays done. Most Americans don't know those plays, and it's because of this kind of this lack of interest in things that are seen as political. Whether or not they're political is a whole different story. But so once I was able to see that, if it's happening to Wallace Shawn and the white guys, then I can't be bitter and angry. I mean, I can and solo show and be angry at it. But I can't, as an artist, I have to, like, I'm not going to change American culture and make everyone really like, politically hot button things in the way that France or England does. Or maybe Occupy is going to make a different kind of audience for theater, but who knows? That's probably several generations away.
It's hard to know. Although I am curious, has it made or will it make a different audience for politics?
Well, I hope it will make politicians more responsive. I really, one has to think in the long term. I'm not one of those people who is angry with Ralph Nader in the way that liberals can act like he destroyed everything in the world, by trying to make a third party that actually was more in line with the politics of many people in the Democratic Party. I think in the long view, had he succeeded in making a third party a viable option, that the idea that we shouldn't aspire for that, I think it's very problematic. I know people who were like, he's the devil, and but I when people say that it's going to split the liberal vote and we're going to end up with Mitt Romney or Newt Gingrich, yes, I think that that's very scary in the short term. But I also think it's more important to think about how we can make our leaders who represent the left more responsive. I think that that's our responsibility, more than securing, yet another Democratic president who really isn't that different from a Republican president on issues that matter to us. I think I think the Occupy Wall Street has the potential, Occupy movement has the potential to harm Obama's chances, which would make me terribly sad. But I also think it's not our job to put Obama in office. It's our job to create a society that has representatives that are responsive and differentiated from each other. But you talk to some people, and it's like you're advocating that Satan come from hell, and I think that that's also a problem within the left-wing community. We've gotten so used to these strictures. It's our job to get a Democratic president in office, and while I think that it's our job I think it's more important to think about ways to to change our society. People can get fanatic about whatever they're interested in doing, but I think what it will make us is more creative. But I am concerned about it harming Obama's chances of winning.
Last couple of questions. Are you basically optimistic or basically pessimistic at this moment?
About the cultural moment?
About the outlook of the world.
Well, like I said, I'm confused. I really did not expect Mubarak's regime to fall. I was nonplussed with who the Egyptians put in power. But I also I believe in the long term. You put religious people in power and they don't feed you any better than the regime before, then your society changes. Like people talking about Ralph Nader, you tell that to some people, they get very upset too, and I understand that, but I don't think. So what I'm basically saying is I'm confused. I did not expect the Arab world to influence and inspire, a younger generation of activists than myself to do what they're doing. So I think we're really in a place of cultural, I don't know, an avalanche of some sort. We don't know what direction it's going in, but I think it can't be bad. So I'm basically optimistic. I think whatever's happening with the Occupy movements, even if it does harm the election chances of a Democratic president, I don't think that's. I think it's a hopeful moment for activists in general.
My favorite signs I saw at an Occupy protest back in October, this woman had a big sign that said, Shit's gonna get weird.
No, it's weird. It's weird, but yeah, it's surprising, and I think shit's been not weird for so long, that none of us know what's going to happen. I mean, I don't think America's on the brink of a revolution of mass proportions, but the idea of just even the idea. Like I was saying about activism or passivism and how we use language. The idea that are you part of a 1% or a 99%? I think a year ago that wouldn't be resonant. The idea of having to identify with one or the other, what you are and what you believe in, I think that it's going to change how, because you're gonna come out of college and you're gonna go, I could be a civil servant. Or work in the nonprofit sector, or I could be part of the 1%. Like it's just a different mind frame. I think that's really. I think anytime we add new language to what it means to be part of an economic system in the way that 1% versus 99% does, I think that's already a huge cultural shift.
Yeah, it certainly has shifted the discussion.
Yeah.
In a good way. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you feel that we should have?
No. Nothing at all.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.